The comm array on Relay Station Themis had been silent for 11 years, 4 months and 7 days, which was precisely why the sound that cracked through the static at 0347 shipboard time made everyone in the listening post freeze mid-motion. It wasn't the usual white noise of a dying universe or the distorted echo of a pulsar's death scream. It was a child's voice, thin and trembling, saying, "Please," before the transmission fractured into a sob that cut off like a blade had fallen. Senior Communications Officer Velis Cord, whose species had 4 hearts and had not evolved to process the sound of distressed younglings without an ancestral freeze response, stared at the waveform as if it had bitten him. The station's backup AI flagged the signal's origin as a vessel class long since retired from every known registry. A Type 7 Orphan carrier, designed to transport displaced children during the century-long scatter war. 50,000 of those ships had launched. 49,999 had been accounted for. This was the missing one. "Replay it," said Commander Sula Dawan, whose species had no hearts at all but whose voice carried the weight of someone who had lost 3 clutches to the void. She stood in the doorway of the listening post, her bioluminescent markings dimmed to near black, which on her world meant complete consuming attention. The recording played again. The child's voice cracked on the second syllable of "please," and then came the crying, not a wail, but the exhausted, hopeless sound of someone who had cried for so long that their body had forgotten how to stop. Sula's markings flickered once, then died entirely. The signal's metadata was worse than the audio. The message had been transmitted on emergency band 12, a frequency reserved for vessels under active, imminent, catastrophic threat. But the timestamp showed the message was sent 637 years ago. The ship's last known position was in the Caldera Nebula, a region now designated as a permanent no-go zone after the Xylos Compact seeded it with temporal mines during the war's final, desperate days. A ship entering that nebula wouldn't just be lost. It would be lost in time, bouncing between pockets of dilated reality, each minute inside potentially translating to decades outside. The crying child had been crying for over 6 centuries. "The message isn't complete," said Cord, his mandibles clicking in frustration as he parsed the signal's fragmented header. "There's a handshake protocol attached, a request for a live response. The ship's AI is still expecting an answer." Sula's markings remained dark. "That's impossible. The power reserves alone. No ship can maintain a handshake for 6 centuries. "Unless the ship isn't experiencing 6 centuries," Cord replied. "Unless for them, the distress call just went out. Right now. And they're waiting." The listening post fell silent. Outside the station's viewport, the nebula's distant glow looked like a bruise spreading across the galaxy's skin. No one had entered the caldera in 200 years, not since the last survey probe emerged as a cloud of atoms that had simultaneously aged 17,000 years and been converted into a type of particle physics that made mathematicians weep. The treaty that ended the scatter war had explicitly forbidden any incursion into the nebula, not because of the temporal mines but because of what else was in there. What both sides had agreed to bury. "We need to log this and forward it to the archive," said Cord, already reaching for the encryption protocols. "Standard procedure for cold case distress signals." Sula's hand closed around his wrist with a grip that would have shattered bone if he'd had any. "Standard procedure," she said slowly, "was written by people who never heard a child cry across 600 years. Send it to the archive, and they'll classify it. File it. Forget it. That child will wait another 6 centuries. What do you suggest we do, Commander? Fly into the nebula? Volunteer for temporal dissolution?" Sula released him and turned to the comm panel. Her fingers hovered over the manual override, a switch that hadn't been flipped since the war ended. "No," she said. "We do something they never expected. We send a response. Not a ship. Not a rescue team. One voice. One pilot who understands that time doesn't matter when a child is waiting." The switch clicked down. The message went out on every frequency the station could muster. Unencrypted, untraceable, and utterly against every regulation in the known galaxy. It was a simple text burst, translated automatically into the Orphan ship's archived language protocols. "We hear you. "Hold on. Help is coming." Within 17 standard minutes, the reply came back, and this time the crying was louder because now there was hope to break against. The only human within 100 light-years was a woman named Thalia Venn, and she was not a hero. Heroes, she often said, had something to prove. Thalia Venn had nothing left to prove except that she could still outrun her past, which was why she piloted a garbage scow called the Last Gasp through the ass end of space, hauling refuse from fringe stations to incinerator stars. The Last Gasp was held together by welding scars and spite, its hull pitted by micrometeoroids, its engines rated for non-emergency velocities, and its life support system prone to playing classical music from a corrupted database whenever the CO2 scrubbers glitched. Thalia had grown accustomed to waking up to Vivaldi and a headache. She was 4 days out from Relay Station Themis when the emergency alert klaxon ripped through her sleep cycle. The Last Gasp's ancient comm unit, which she'd jury-rigged to scan for any signal stronger than interstellar static, had detected a broadcast that should have been impossible. A direct text message addressed to any human vessel, with a priority override that her ship's system shouldn't have recognized, let alone obeyed. The message was brief. Human pilot required for temporal rescue operation, Caldera Nebula. Respond immediately. Children are dying. Thalia stared at the words for a long time. Then she laughed because laughter was cheaper than screaming. The Caldera Nebula was a death sentence wrapped in a time paradox. Even if she made it through the temporal minefield, even if she found the Orphan ship, even if she somehow extracted 600-year-old children who should have been dust, she would emerge to find that everyone she'd ever known had aged into memory. The galaxy would have moved on. She would be a relic, a ghost, a woman who'd traded her future for a distress call that had already expired before her grandparents were born. She turned off the alert and went back to sleep. She woke up to Vivaldi and the sound of a child crying. Not a recording this time. A live transmission, raw and unfiltered, bleeding through the Last Gasp's comm unit with such clarity that Thalia could hear the small, wet gasps between sobs. A voice, young, strained but determined, said, "My name is Ziggy. I am 7 years old. There are 43 of us left. The grown-ups are gone. The ship is breaking. Please. We don't know how much longer we can wait." Thalia Venn had done many things in her 42 years. She had piloted gunships in the border wars. She had watched her squadron burn. She had buried her wife in a frozen plot on a colony that no longer existed. She had promised herself that she would never again care about something she couldn't save. But she had never, not once, heard a child introduce themselves like an adult, using their age as a shield, because no one else was left to hold it for them. She sat in the pilot's chair for 3 hours, staring at the nav computer's calculation of the route to the Caldera Nebula. The computer estimated a 73% chance of catastrophic temporal decoherence, a 41% chance of never arriving at all, a 92% chance that even if she succeeded, she would return to find the galaxy aged beyond recognition, her friends dead, her contracts void, her life reduced to a historical footnote. The child's voice played on a loop in her head. "My name is Ziggy. I am 7 years old." Thalia Venn engaged the engines. The Last Gasp was not built for speed, but it was built for endurance, and Thalia had spent 20 years learning how to squeeze performance from garbage. She rerouted power from non-essential systems, the galley, the hygiene unit, the backup oxygen recycler, and channeled everything into the thrusters. The ship groaned like a dying animal, but it moved. Behind her, Relay Station Themis sent a flurry of frantic hails, ordering her to stand down, warning her of legal consequences, threatening to have her license revoked. She broadcast a single response. 43 children, 7 years old. Tell the archive to save their paperwork. Then she cut all incoming communications and flew into the dark. The Caldera Nebula looked like a wound from a distance, but up close it looked like a trap. The outer edge shimmered with the residual energy of temporal mines, spheres of frozen time that hung in the void like malignant pearls, each one containing a moment of the scatter war's worst violence. Thalia's sensors screamed warnings as she approached, painting the nebula's boundary in shades of lethal radiation and probability collapse. The last gasp's nav computer, which had never been particularly optimistic, now displayed a single blinking word. No. Noted, Thalia said and flew through. The first mine detonated 12 seconds later. But detonated was the wrong word. It unfolded. A sphere of distorted space bloomed around the last gasp, and suddenly Thalia's clock was wrong. Her wrist chronometer showed 347, but the ship's internal logs showed 1862. Her heart had beaten twice, but her hair had grown a millimeter. She tasted copper and smelled rain. The rain from her wedding day, 20 years ago, when her wife had laughed and said they'd grow old together. The memory was so vivid that Thalia reached out to touch it, and her hand passed through the air where her wife's face had been. She ripped her hand back and slammed the throttle forward. The last gasp shuddered through the mine's wake, and time snapped back into alignment. Mostly. Her chronometer now read 0349. 2 minutes had passed outside. Inside, she had lost 3 days. Her beard had grown. Her fingernails had yellowed. She was older by 72 hours, and she hadn't even left the nebula's edge. 1, she said, counting the mines she could see. There were hundreds. This is going to be a long flight. It took her 11 days to cross the minefield. By galactic standards, she traveled less than 2 light hours. By her own experience, she aged 11 years. Her hair went gray at the temples. Lines carved themselves around her eyes. The last gasp, which had been old when she bought it, now groaned with the infirmities of a ship that had been flying for decades longer than its engineering. The engines coughed smoke. The hull developed microfractures that Thalia patched with sealant and prayers. The food synthesizer broke down, and she subsisted on protein paste that tasted like sadness and regret, but she crossed. And on the 11th day, the nebula's interior opened before her, and she saw the Orphan ship for the first time. It was beautiful in the way that ruins are beautiful. A skeleton of what had once been hope. The Type 7 Orphan carrier Vanguard of Mercy hung in the void like a fallen cathedral, its hull scorched by temporal energy, its docking bays gaping open, its nameplate barely legible beneath centuries of cosmic erosion. But light still flickered in its observation dome. Power still pulsed along its spine. And as Thalia's sensors swept the vessel, they detected 43 life signs. 43 small, warm, impossibly persistent heartbeats. "Ziggy," Thalia said into the comm, her voice hoarse from disuse and age. "This is Pilot Thalia Ven, I'm here." The reply took 17 seconds. When it came, the child's voice was different. Older somehow, despite the temporal disparity. Ziggy had been waiting for over 6 centuries outside, but inside the nebula's warped time. How long had it been? Thalia did the math and felt her remaining hope curdle. The Orphan ship had been lost for 637 years. If time inside the nebula flowed at a rate of 1 day per decade outside, then the children on that ship had experienced. "Pilot Ven," Ziggy said, and the child's voice had the measured calm of someone who had learned to stop crying because crying wasted moisture. "We have been waiting for you for 42 years. Thalia closed her eyes. 42 years. A 7-year-old child had grown to middle age on that ship. The other 42 survivors, assuming they had been of similar age when the ship entered the nebula, were now adults. Some might be elderly. Some might have died of old age in the time it had taken Thalia to cross the minefield. She had aged 11 years in 11 days. They had aged 42 years in 6 centuries. Time had become a weapon, and everyone was bleeding. "I'm docking now," Thalia said because there was nothing else to say. "Prepare for evacuation." The docking bay was a mausoleum. Thalia cycled the last gasp's airlock and stepped into a cavernous space filled with shadows and the skeletal remains of shuttles that had been cannibalized for parts decades ago. The bay's environmental systems were failing. The air was cold and thin, barely breathable, but someone had strung lights along the walls, a string of fairy lights that blinked in cheerful colors that seemed obscene in the darkness. A small figure stood beneath them, waiting. Ziggy was not small. Ziggy was 49 years old, and 49 years of survival aboard a dying ship had carved him into something sharp and watchful. His face was lined, his hair streaked with white, his eyes holding the flat affect of someone who had seen too many friends buried in the recycler. But he still wore the faded jumpsuit of a child passenger, the knees patched, the cuffs frayed, and when he saw Thalia, he did something that broke her heart into pieces small enough to swallow. He smiled. Not a grateful smile, not a desperate smile. A relieved smile. The smile of someone who had been told to wait for a rescue that would never come. And then, impossibly, it came. "You're real," Ziggy said. "We thought you might be a hallucination. The air's been bad for a while. Carbon dioxide does things to the brain." Thalia looked at the fairy lights, at the patched jumpsuit, at the 49-year-old man who still introduced himself as 7 years old, because that was the last time anyone had cared enough to ask. "How many of you are there?" she asked. 43, Ziggy said. "We started with 312. The grown-ups died first. They gave us their rations, their oxygen, their time. Then the older kids. Then..." He stopped, swallowed. "We learned how to stretch things, how to make the recyclers run on hope, how to bury our dead in the hydroponics bay so they could become food. You don't want to know the rest." Thalia didn't. She didn't need to. She had seen enough horror in the border wars to know that survival had a cost that couldn't be measured in calories or cubic meters of oxygen. "How fast is time moving for you now?" she asked. Ziggy tilted his head, considering. "Faster than it used to. The temporal mines are decaying. When we first crashed here, 1 day inside was a year outside. Now it's closer to 1 day inside for every month outside. We're catching up. In another 50 years, we'll be synchronized with the rest of the galaxy." 50 years, Thalia repeated. "You've been here 42. You're telling me you can survive another 50? Ziggy's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went dark. "We have 43 people left. Our hydroponics bay is failing. Our recycler is breaking down. Our medic, her name is Soraya, she was 6 when we crashed, she's 48 now, says we have maybe 2 years of food left. 3 if we start rationing again. But we've been rationing for 42 years. There's nothing left to cut." Thalia did the math. 2 years inside the nebula, 2 years of ship time. But outside, in the galaxy she'd left behind, 2 years would be decades. She could load all 43 survivors onto the last gasp and fly back through the minefield. But the return journey would age them further. Some of the older survivors might not survive the temporal stress. Others might emerge to find that everyone they'd ever known was gone, that the galaxy had no place for refugees from a war that ended 6 centuries ago. "There's another option," Thalia said slowly. "The minefield isn't just a barrier, it's a network. If I can find the central mine, the one that's generating the temporal field, I might be able to destabilize it, collapse the field, synchronize this pocket of space with the outside galaxy." Ziggy stared at her. "You'd be flying into the heart of the nebula. The temporal distortion there is strongest. You'd age years in minutes." "I'm already old," Thalia said. "What's a few more years?" It was a lie, and they both knew it. Thalia was 53 now, her body aged by the minefield's passage, her reflexes slowed, her joints aching. Flying into the nebula's core would add decades to her frame. She might not survive. She almost certainly wouldn't emerge young enough to matter. But Ziggy didn't argue. He just nodded, because he had spent 42 years learning when to accept help and when to demand more. "Soraya will want to come with you," he said. "She's our medic, and she's the only one who studied the mines." Thalia met Soraya 10 minutes later in what had once been the ship's cafeteria. The room was lined with hydroponic troughs, most of them empty, the few surviving plants glowing green under UV lights that had been repaired so many times they flickered like dying stars. Soraya was small and wiry, with the kind of muscles that came from lifting oxygen tanks and dragging bodies to the recycler. Her hair was completely white, but her face was young. The temporal field had been kinder to her than to Ziggy, or perhaps she had simply been younger when the ship crashed. She looked at Thalia with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who had spent decades triaging the impossible. "You're human," Soraya said. "Not a question." "Last time I checked," Thalia replied. "Good. The other species would have filed a report. debated the ethics, formed a committee. Soraya picked up a battered medkit and slung it over her shoulder. You just showed up. That's why we're still alive. Someone, somewhere, decided to act instead of discuss. Thalia felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like a yoke. She wasn't a hero. She was a woman who had run from her past until the past caught up. And now here she was, standing on a dying ship with 43 survivors who had outlasted every rational expectation. They deserved someone better than her. But she was what they had. Let's go blow up a mine, she said. The last gasp's engines protested as Thalia piloted the ship deeper into the nebula. The temporal mines grew thicker here, their surfaces crawling with distorted light, each one a trap waiting to spring. Soraya sat in the co-pilot's chair, her medkit open on her lap, her eyes fixed on the sensor display. She had been 6 years old when the vanguard of Mercy entered the nebula, fleeing the final battle of the Scatter War. She had watched the captain age to dust in the space of an hour. She had watched the adults sacrifice themselves one by one, until only the children remained. She had watched the children become adults, then become old, then become ghosts. The central mine is different from the others, Soraya said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. It's not a weapon, it's a beacon. The Xylos Compact placed it here to mark the grave of their flagship. They never expected anyone to come looking. Thalia frowned. A grave? There's a shipwreck at the nebula's core? Soraya nodded. The Sovereign of Blades, the Compact's most advanced warship. It was carrying something when it went down, something valuable enough that both sides agreed to bury it in a time-locked tomb, rather than let the other side recover it. The sensor display flickered and Thalia saw it, a massive wreck, its hull blackened by centuries of temporal decay, its shape barely recognizable as a vessel. But even through the distortion, even through the static, one thing was clear. The Sovereign of Blades was not empty. Energy signatures pulsed from its core, regular and rhythmic like a heartbeat. What was it carrying? Thalia asked, though she already knew the answer. Soraya's hand stopped trembling. Children. Xylos children. The Compact was evacuating its own younglings when the war turned against them. The Sovereign of Blades was supposed to take them to a safe world beyond the galaxy's rim. But the human fleet intercepted them. The battle destroyed both sides. The humans didn't know there were children on board. Or maybe they did. And they didn't care. The records were sealed. The truth was buried. Thalia's blood ran cold. The Scatter War had been fought over resources, territory, and the ancient hatred between species. But this was something else. A ship full of children, caught in the crossfire, left to die in a time-locked grave while both sides pretended they didn't exist. The treaty that ended the war hadn't forbidden entry to the Caldera Nebula to protect the survivors. It had forbidden entry to protect the secret. How many? Thalia whispered. Our sensors can't penetrate the wreck, Soraya said. But the energy signatures, the life support systems are still running. The temporal field around the Sovereign is different from the mines. It's a stasis field, designed to preserve, not distort. If the Xylos children are still alive in there, they haven't aged a day. They've been waiting, frozen, for 6 centuries. Thalia stared at the wreck. 43 human survivors, aged and exhausted, clinging to life on a dying ship. And somewhere inside that blackened hull, an unknown number of Xylos children, preserved in stasis, unaware that the war that trapped them had ended centuries ago. 2 orphan ships, 2 sets of children, 1 chance. The central mine, Thalia said slowly. It's not just a beacon, it's a lock. If I disable it, the stasis field around the Xylos ship will collapse. But so will the temporal mines protecting this entire region. Everyone inside the nebula will synchronize with outside time. Your people will stop aging. The Xylos children will wake up. Soraya nodded. And the temporal energy released by the collapse will be immense. It could destroy everything within 100 light years. Or it could open a corridor, a stable path out of the nebula. The math isn't clear. The math is never clear, Thalia muttered. She looked at the last gasp's chronometer. Outside in the galaxy, months had passed since she entered the nebula. Inside, she had aged another 3 years. Her hands were gnarled now, her vision blurred at the edges. She didn't have many years left, but she had enough. "Get back to the Vanguard," she told Soraya. "Tell Ziggy to prepare everyone for evacuation. I'm going to the central mine." Soraya didn't argue. She just placed her small, weathered hand on Thalia's arm and said, "You're not a hero, you're better, you're a human who showed up." Then she cycled through the airlock and floated back toward the Orphan ship, a ghost in a patched jumpsuit, carrying 42 years of hope in her chest. The central mine was beautiful in the way that black holes are beautiful, a sphere of absolute darkness surrounded by a halo of fractured light. Thalia brought the last gasp as close as she dared, then suited up and crossed the remaining distance on thrusters, her tether trailing behind her like an umbilical cord. The mine's surface was smooth and cold, unmarked by any control panel or access point. It had been designed to be impenetrable, eternal, a monument to a war that no one wanted to remember. Thalia placed her hand on the mine's surface, and the mine spoke to her, not in words, in memories. Her wife's face smiling, her squadron burning, the child's voice saying please. The mine showed her all the moments she had failed, all the people she had lost, all the reasons she should turn back and let the dead stay dead. It showed her a future where she succeeded, where she collapsed the temporal field and saved the children. And then it showed her the cost. She would emerge from the nebula aged beyond recognition, her body broken, her mind fragmented by temporal stress. She would live, but she would not be the same. She would be a stranger in her own skin, a relic of a past that no longer existed. She could leave. The mine would let her leave. She could go back to the last gasp, fly out of the nebula, and pretend none of this had happened. The children would survive a little longer. The Xylos children would sleep a little longer. The secret would stay buried. Thalia Venn had run from her past for 20 years. She had run from the memory of her wife, from the guilt of her squadron, from the weight of her own survival. But she was done running. She reached into the mine's surface and pulled. The temporal field collapsed with a sound that wasn't a sound, a scream that Thalia felt in her bones, in her blood, in the spaces between her cells. Time rushed back into alignment, centuries of distortion unraveling in seconds. The last gasp's hull groaned. The Orphan ship's lights flickered and flared. The Sovereign of Blades cracked open like an egg, and from its core came a flood of energy signatures, hundreds of them, thousands, all pulsing with the steady rhythm of stasis fields disengaging. Thalia floated in the center of the storm, her suit's alarms screaming, her body screaming, her mind screaming. She felt years slough off her like dead skin, then pile back on. She was young, then old, then young again. The mind's energy passed through her, and when it was done, she was exactly as she had been at the start. 42 years old, unaged, unchanged. The temporal field had collapsed so completely that it had undone its own effects. She was a walking paradox, a woman who had lived 11 years and 11 days and then unlived them in the space of a heartbeat. She didn't have time to process it. The Sovereign of Blades was breaking apart, and from its wreckage came ships, small shuttles, life pods, escape craft, all of them carrying the Xylos children. They were young, so young, their faces pressed against viewports, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. They had been asleep for 6 centuries. They had woken to find their war over, their species changed, their galaxy alien. They were orphans too. Thalia guided the last gasp back to the Vanguard of Mercy, where Ziggy and Soraya were already loading survivors into the cargo bay. 43 people, ranging in age from 49 to 67, all of them blinking in the sudden brightness of a universe that had stopped trying to kill them. Ziggy met Thalia at the airlock, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ziggy said, "The Xylos children. There are over 2,000 of them." Thalia nodded. "We don't have room for 2,000. No," Ziggy agreed. "But we don't have to take them all the way, we just have to get them out of the nebula. After that, their people will find them." The compact may have buried this secret, but they can't bury 2,000 crying children. Thalia looked at the Sovereign's wreckage, at the shuttles drifting in the void, at the small faces in the viewports. She thought about the message that had started all of this. A child crying, a human answering. She thought about the 43 survivors who had waited 42 years for a rescue that should have been impossible. She thought about the 2,000 Xylos children who had slept through 6 centuries of war and peace and forgetting. She thought about her wife, buried on a colony that no longer existed. She thought about her squadron, burning in the void. She thought about all the things she couldn't save, all the people she couldn't bring back, all the moments she couldn't undo. Then she thought about what she could do. "Let's go home," she said. The trip out of the nebula took 3 days. The temporal mines were gone, their energy spent in the collapse, and the last gasp flew through clear space for the first time in centuries. Behind her, the vanguard of Mercy followed, its ancient engines straining but holding. Beside her, the Xylos shuttles formed a ragged formation. Their pilots, children, all of them, the oldest no more than 12, learning to fly by instinct and desperation. Relay Station Themis hailed them as they emerged. Commander Sula Dawan's voice was thick with emotion, her bioluminescent markings blazing bright enough to light the entire comm screen. "Thalia Ven, you're alive. You're all alive. How?" "We answered a call," Thalia said simply. "Now we need help. 2,000 Xylos refugees, 43 human survivors, 1 garbage scow with a broken coffee maker. You know anyone who can take them?" There was a long pause. Then Sula laughed, a wet, shaky sound that turned into a sob. "I know everyone. I'll make some calls." The last message from the orphan ship had ended with a child crying, but the first message from the rescue fleet began with a child laughing. Ziggy, who had been 7 years old for 42 years, finally let himself believe that he could be 49. Soraya, who had been a medic since she was 6, finally let herself cry. And the Xylos children, waking from a 6th-century sleep to find a human pilot waiting for them, learned that the war was over. They had lost. They had won. They had survived. Thalia Ven sat in the pilot's chair of the last gasp, watching the nebula shrink behind her. Her hands were steady. Her heart was full. She had answered a call that no one else would answer, and in doing so, she had answered every call she had ever run from. Her wife would have been proud. Her squadron would have understood. She opened the comm to all channels and said, "This is Pilot Thalia Ven, commanding the rescue vessel Last Gasp. I have 43 human survivors and 2,112 Xylos children aboard my formation. We need medical assistance, housing, and a very large pot of coffee. Anyone out there willing to help?" The replies came from every direction, from every species, from every corner of the galaxy. They came from stations and ships and colonies and worlds. They came from people who had heard the crying and wished they could answer. They came from people who had been waiting for someone to show them that it was possible to care again. And somewhere, in the static between the signals, Thalia heard a small voice say, "Thank you." She didn't know which child it was. It didn't matter. She answered.